NATO members are feeling the heat from the Iran war as Tehran hits back at countries across the region, many of which host US military facilities. Last week, a UK base in Cyprus was targeted by Iranian drones, and Turkey is being drawn in as well. Michael J. Williams is an expert in international security and NATO. He's my guest in a moment. But first, on Monday, Turkey said a ballistic missile launched from Iran was neutralised near the southeastern city of Gaziantep, just a few hundred kilometres from the Incirlik air base, which is home to US personnel. It was the second missile intercepted over Turkey since the start of the war. Iran's president has tried to distance Tehran from the incident, telling his Turkish counterpart Recep Tayyip Erdogan that Iran stands ready to assist in an investigation. But first, let's listen to this warning from President Erdogan to Iran, telling Tehran it was putting their good relations at risk.
Despite our sincere warnings, extremely wrong and provocative steps continue to be taken that will put Turkey's friendship at risk. We must not engage in any scheme that will inflict deep wounds in the hearts and minds of our nation and cast a shadow over our 1,000-year-old neighborly and brotherly relations. Turkey's position and stance are clear. Its extraordinary efforts to prevent further spread of the conflict and bloodshed are also evident.
DW correspondent Dorian Jones is following this story for us from Istanbul. Here's his summary of what happened.
The Turkish Defence Ministry, in a statement, strongly condemned a missile strike aimed at Turkey. It said the missile was shot down in the Gaziantep province, which borders Syria, just 200 kilometres or so from the important Turkish air base of Incirlik, which hosts a large American Air Force presence, including nuclear weapons. It is the second strike by Iranian missiles in less than a week. The Turkish Defence Ministry said that all means at its disposal will be used decisively to defend Turkey. Turkey has a number of military options at its disposal. It has NATO's second largest army, a large military air force, as well as a large drone force as well. It's also a member of NATO, and it could invoke NATO's Article 5, which says an attack on one member is an attack on all. But Turkey is very wary of an escalation in the war against Iran. The Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been in the forefront of calling for a diplomatic solution, and has been in contact with a number of its foreign leaders in a bid to seek a diplomatic solution to the conflict. President Erdogan is also aware that if Turkey was to be embroiled in a conflict with Iran, this would put major pressure on Turkey's financial markets, which are already reeling from $100 plus a barrel of oil, stoking fears of a potential currency crisis going forward. But a key factor in Ankar's decision on how it will act is who does it believe is responsible for carrying out these missile strikes. Tehran denies it is responsible, but Ankara is also aware that since the onset of the war against Iran, Iran has employed the Mosaic Defense Doctrine, which sees a major decentralization of decisions by the military's local commanders. And it is plausible that possibly a local military commanders could be responsible for these attacks, given the fact that it is considered that there was any hope of an attack on the very well protected Turkish air base of Incirlik would require a sustained barrage of far more than just 2 missiles. Who is responsible for this attack? Is it a sign of Tehran's new strategy that it will now target Turkey going forward, or whether it's the local commanders will be key to deciding what steps Ankara will take. For now, at least, it's expected to ramp up its diplomatic pressure on Tehran that these attacks on Turkey have to end, and they have to end now.
Dorian Jones there, and it's great to welcome Michael J. Williams now. He's an expert on NATO and Professor of International Affairs at Syracuse University. Michael, thank you so much for your time. Now, Iran has denied wanting to attack Turkey, but it is the second time an Iranian ballistic missile has entered Turkish airspace. What do you think the most likely scenario is here? Could it be a rogue missile, a provocation, or perhaps something else?
Well, it's always possible that it could be a rogue missile. However, the Iranians have struck all across the region. So rather than isolating their attacks to just U.S. targets and Israeli targets who are conducting the military operations against them, it looks like they've targeted purposefully Turkey as well as all members of the Gulf Cooperation Council. So that can't just be an accident, the number of missiles that have hit all these countries in different places. So it really sort of degrades the Iranian protest that they are doing this accidentally, that it wasn't with purpose. So I think it's part of their strategy. What's interesting is that it seems to be a counterproductive strategy. If they had chosen to isolate the military force against Israel and the United States, that would give the local powers sort of more space to sort of push for peace. But with their targeting them, it puts them in a difficult position that they'll need to respond and potentially get involved themselves.
Given what you've just said, what types of deliberations will Turkey be doing in order to work out what its response will be?
Yeah, well, there's definitely extensive internal deliberations going on in Ankara as they probably weigh different options and sort of figure out whether or not they want to retaliate now or whether it would be over another period of time where they might do that. There are also going to be deliberations with NATO allies bilaterally. They have not invoked Article 4. So Article 4 is the mutual consultation clause of the Washington Treaty that established NATO, whereby the member will then raise this to be discussed at the North Atlantic Council, which is the premier body for discussions. And so that would precede an Article 5 self-defense invocation. So they haven't done that. And I think they don't want to, because even just having consultations formally within NATO sort of elevate the issue. And I think they want to try and keep it localized. They want to try and keep this bilaterally between Tehran and Ankara. And so I'm sure there's also, third and finally, a lot of back channel discussions going on with Tehran. The Iranians have signaled they're willing to do an investigation to see what was happening here. Again, it could be just a protest, but I'm sure they're trying to probably de-escalate things at the moment. They don't want this to become a wider regional conflict.
So you're saying that Article 4, this deliberation clause, would sort of elevate this incident, something that Turkey doesn't want. So at the moment, based on what you're saying, it doesn't seem likely at the moment that NATO, as a broader alliance, could be drawn into this.
Well, not at the moment. I mean, NATO is involved in the sense that it's NATO air defense assets that are positioned to defend Turkey that have shot down the missiles. So in a certain sense, NATO is already involved. And I'm sure that the Turks are speaking with their NATO allies. Consultation is always happening at NATO, right? The Article 4, invoking Article 4 would kind of be like a first step to really push back a little harder against the Iranians. But I think they don't want to do that right now. I'm also sure that there's probably a lot of worry within the alliance outside of Turkey about this broadening, right? The European allies in particular want to really keep this as a localized conflict. They're already needing to mobilize military assets to protect their own folks in the region, their own military assets that aren't necessarily involved. You've seen the British now saying they're doing defensive military operations, so being sort of pulled in through the back door. So I don't think Turkey wants to further internationalize the conflict, but it is a step that they may take at some point to really start signaling to the Iranians their intent.
We heard the warning from the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan a little bit earlier, and I'm wondering what Washington is going to, how it's going to see this. Could Washington possibly use this incident as an opportunity to maybe demand that Turkey support its own efforts to bring down the Islamic regime?
Well, Washington could do that. They might try and draw them in that way. I mean, the difficult situation here then is that they risk being rebuffed by Ankara. Erdogan does not really want to broaden the conflict. They do not want to be directly involved. They have refused to allow U.S. forces to operate from Incirlik, which is a major U.S. Air Force base in Turkey, which again makes this strike so odd in the sense that it was seemingly targeting that base, which the Turks have forbidden the Americans from using. So again, why would you strike Turkey or a U.S. base in Turkey when the Turks have really tried to keep it outside of the conflict? So it really is an strategic decision if they're doing that purposefully, just like all of the strikes against the Gulf Cooperation conflict. It's really put them more in the U.S. court than it would make them agnostic about the war, regardless of how much they dislike Tehran. So I think that they could try and pressure Turks, but I think also if wiser minds prevail in the administration, they'll realize that wouldn't be particularly good because the Turks don't want to be drawn in, and they could push back, and that would make Washington look weaker.
Yeah, as you're saying, Turkey doesn't want to be in this conflict. It wants to keep the country out of the war. So what are the diplomatic options here from Turkey's point of view?
Well, I think number one will be to continue bilateral talks with the Iranians, probably launch some sort of joint investigation to figure out what was happening, and they keep the back channels open. They're also going to probably also start considering a set of strike packages that if this happens again or a couple more times, they may have to do at least some sort of symbolic strike against the Iranians to signal their resolve. You'll note that when the Russians were supporting Syria with air operations, a Russian jet strayed allegedly into Turkish airspace, and the Turks shot it right down, killing the pilot. And that created a slight crisis of relations between Russia and Turkey, but they managed to overcome that. And it let the Russians know that such instances would not be tolerated. So I'm sure the Turks are deliberating that. But again, they're probably going to face some pressure from other NATO allies in Europe to sort of keep the temperature cooler. I think they also want to keep the temperature cooler themselves. The U.S. administration, that's a little more questionable. They might quite like to have Turkey more involved in the conflict.
Could we talk a little bit more about Turkey's red lines? And you were saying just a moment ago about possible symbolic strikes if things progress.
Well, I mean, so signaling is what we call it professionally, right? And where essentially they wouldn't necessarily do a wide scale target package and hit multiple things and really try and elevate the war. But it's sort of a tit for tat reciprocal strike. So, all right, we've had 2 missiles hit towards us. They'll target something innocuous. It would be military in nature. It would definitely avoid civilians as the signal of resolve. And so you'll often see that proportional response is what it would be. And so they're probably looking at those options. But again, given how difficult things are already, the price of oil already going up, the Turkish economy will be on an edge. I think that that's going to probably be a last resort. But I think they're going to make it very clear to the Iranians that if this happens again, there probably will be some sort of active response from Ankara.
Michael, thank you so much for your analysis today. We've been speaking with Michael J. Williams, a NATO expert and Professor of International Studies at Syracuse University. Thanks a lot to Michael for answering our questions, and we'd love to answer yours as well. If you've got anything to say, please do write it in the comments. And if you'd like to see more content like this, please do hit like and subscribe to the DW News channel.